Thank you all for coming. We're about to get started.
Okay.
Again, on behalf of Harambe, my name is Chandra Cunningham, and I'm the president this year. So I just want to welcome you all to our Hip Hop and Religion Forum. It's been a long way coming, but we're glad we're finally here. If I could freestyle, I would right now, because I'm so excited. Hip, 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 hop. That's about all I got, actually. Nonetheless, this is our culminating event to Black History Month. We've had several events throughout the month, one in which Professor Jacob Alupana spoke and gave a conversation speech. We had another one in which we featured some quote makers from New York who came up. And I don't know if many of you went upstairs to Andover Chapel through yesterday. They were hanging up throughout, and that was very beautiful. And we had a documentary featuring that last week. We also hosted a noonday service in which we focused on African spiritualities throughout the diaspora last week. And we hosted noonday service, or noonday service as well as community tea, rather. And we featured some Ethiopian food. So we've pretty much been busy. And we're glad to finally be here. And now to deal with hip-hop and religion. And this is our more innovative event of the month. In particular, we decided to do this as a way to pay tribute to the ways in which religion interplays with hip-hop. And so we invited these 6 panelists, each of which bring their own expertise. Some are scholars, some are practitioners. And they're going to speak to different topics, placing it within the realm of Black popular culture, as well as social and political activism, as well as higher education, and a number of other things. So without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for the evening. We are fortunate to have Professor Marcyliena Morgan, who is both the founder and the director of the Hiphop Archive here at Harvard, for those that didn't know. And she holds BA and MA degrees from the University of Illinois. She is the author of many publications that focus on youth, gender, language, culture, identity, sociolinguistics, discourse, and interaction. She has a forthcoming book that's called The Real Hip Hop, Battling for Knowledge, Power, and Respect in the Underground. And we're fortunate to have her here with us. When I met with her about a month ago, she mentioned that she would moderate this event as long as we kept the flavor in it. So she mentioned a lot of academic and kind of symposiums meet, but they don't really have that kind of flavor to it. So as long as we came together to pontificate but kept the flavor, she would do it. And so we're fortunate to have her here. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Marcyliena Morgan.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction. I'd like, before I begin, to thank everyone on behalf of the panel who organized this event. In particular, of course, I would like to thank our main host, Chandra Lee Cunningham, who's done just incredible work. I do want to say, she tracked me down because I was going zip coast, and she's like, every time I get off a plane, there was a message. I was like, all right. And the entire Harambe group, thank you so much for putting on such an event. We'd also like to thank Carrie Maloney and Angela Counts for their support as well. This is an incredible moment. It is, we're about to, I'm sure, have a fantastic evening. And why don't you come and have a seat? Okay. I just like a full panel. So the point about flavor and hip hop is not about toning it down. It's bringing it up. Okay, it's really dealing with the serious issues in serious ways, the way youth deal with it, the way, if you can remember back when you were a teenager, when the most important thing in the world was happening around you, and you didn't realize at that time you were just like focusing on you and, your friends and everything, but it's this moment that's an absolutely beautiful moment that youth get involved in hip hop. And we have to learn more and more about how to embrace that moment instead of just moving into that moment with the adult power critique of it. And so it is really, it's just wonderful that we're doing this on religion in particular, because it is something that virtually everyone involved in hip hop cares about and talks about. It's prayer, redemption, Christianity, Islam, 5%, holy, Jesus walking deeply in the lives of hip hop. And we remember the days of the Ghetto Boys from Houston, Texas, Scarface, Willie D, and Bushwick Bill. This is in the 90s, the early 90s. They were the last people you would have expected to introduce a hip hop song that would deal with redemption, God, right and wrong, good and bad, because they were the sort of purveyors of bad in many respects. Prior to their release, Mind Playing Tricks on Me, they had released The Mind of a Lunatic, where there were graphic portrayals of rape, necrophilia, and murder. And then they end up with Mind Playing Trick on Me. And once that happened, we knew we had to confront or deal with how to talk to the hip-hop generation about religion. Old ways talking about religion were not simply going to work. And here are some of the lyrics from that. I live by the sword. I take my boys everywhere I go because I'm paranoid. I keep looking over my shoulder and peeping around corners. My mind is playing tricks on me. Day by day, it's more impossible to cope. I feel like I'm the one that's doing dope. Can't keep a steady hand because I'm nervous. Every Sunday morning I'm in service, praying for forgiveness and trying to find an exit out of this business. I know the Lord is looking at me, but yet and still, it's hard for me to feel happy. His mind is playing tricks on him. So this is the dope dealer. This is the representative of that person in the community that they bring into hip hop in one of the most powerful ways. So also when Nas, Mos Def, and others are labeled conscious, sometimes because they have a Muslim background, but deemed not Muslims very often by those who identify their religion as Islam, we know that our minds are playing tricks on us as well. So this panel in many ways is a blessing because it reflects the future of hip-hop scholarship and commitment to spirituality while critiquing both traditional and everyday practices of religion and hip-hop. We welcome you all and hope that you engage the panelists and each other and your friends and your community. And as Mos Def says, and I'm doing it from two songs, the Bible, the Quran, or the 10 crack commandments, speak on it, God. What's today's mathematics? The 5-day forecast, the Dow Jones average, the price of beer, cigarettes, bread, milk, and Pampers. Life is a test, and we all got the answer. The streets keep calling. It's hard not to answer because it's deeper. This is another song. Sweeter, richer, crisper, stronger reception, and sharper picture. Revolve around God and involve with niggas. These elements I perform my scripture. Your brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, the lovers, the leavers, the doubters, believers, the stayers, the quitters, the bitches, the niggas, rebel guerrillas, the ghetto civilians, y'all gonna feel it from the first to the millionth. It's extraordinary and plain. I walk 1,000 paces of light ahead of the game. By the time you get where I'm standing, I'll be gone. Y'all make moves, but y'all just move on. Our minds are not playing tricks on us tonight. Tonight we're dealing and facing some of the most important issues in hip-hop in our lives, and we're doing it with hip-hop and religion. And I welcome you all and this panel. So I want to say a few words about the background of the panel and some of the questions that Chandra and folks at Harambe have been wrestling with and hope the panel address. Our first presenter is DJ Lady Grace. Born and raised in Boston in a very conservative Christian home, listening to the traditional gospel sounds of Shirley Caesar and the Winans. Although she heard a few Christian rap songs while growing up, her first exposure to the real ministry side of it was in 1999 when the Cross Movement came to Cambridge, Massachusetts to minister. It was that night that God gave her the call and put a burning desire in her heart to promote uncompromising ministry-minded artists ministries that can reach the youth and young adults in the hip-hop culture. Her work as a mobile DJ and radio personality is out of her obedience to fulfill that God-given call and responsibility. Mariam Sharif is a candidate for the master's degree at Harvard Divinity School. Her work is primarily on Islamic and Judaic studies. She received her bachelor's from Rutgers University in Middle Eastern Studies. She's worked for Georgetown University Center of Christian Muslim Understanding and hosted her own television program entitled Muslims on Air. Her interests include the legacy of historical female scholarship within Islam and Judaism, the African American Shiite phenomena, and religion on the silver screen. Mariam is also a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Islam in America, published by Greenwood Press. Yosef Soret was born and raised in the greater Boston area and graduated from Lexington Christian Academy in 1991. Following high school, he matriculated to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and graduated there with honors. I just want to make sure that in this he mentions the Hiphop Archive. Let me just get to that point. Because he was one of the founding groups with the Hiphop Archive. That's right. After graduating from Oral Roberts, he returned home because, he was at Oral Roberts, and enrolled in BU School of Technology to pursue the Master of Divinity degree with specialization in religion and literature and African diaspora. While at BU, he received the prestigious university-wide Whitney M. Young Fellowship. So I'm not going to read it all because if I read it all, everybody's got quite a bit. So we love you, Joseph. His dissertation, Spirit Soundings, Religion, Race, and the Arts in 20th Century America, engages the lives of black artists as a lens into the American religious landscape. In support of his research, Joseph has received fellowships from a number of institutions, too many to be mentioned here. In addition to his academic pursuits, he maintains an active commitment to public service. He's taught at many universities in the New York and Boston area. While at BU, he served as director of youth ministries at the historic Charles Street African Methodist Episcopal Church. He has also worked as a consultant for such organizations as the Boston Capacity Tank, United Way of Massachusetts Bay, and Public-Private Ventures. Joseph is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He is finishing up his dissertation this semester, and he lives with his wife, not in New York City, but in
Brooklyn.
And I hope I pronounced your name perfectly. The Reverend Asakefo Uhuru Seku?
That'll do.
Okay. It's considered one of the foremost religious leaders of his generation. Reverend Seku was the founding national coordinator for clergy and laity concerned with Iraq, which represented over 300 faith-based institutions and organizations around the country working to end the war and occupation in Iraq. In response to the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina, Reverend Seku moved to New Orleans for 6 months and founded the Interfaith Worker Justice Center for New Orleans, opening a workers' rights legal clinic, and working with organizing labor toward the unionization of the hotel workers. Reverend Seku is a professor of preaching at the Seminary Consortium of Urban Pastoral Education and the Graduate Theological Urban Studies program in Chicago, Illinois. He has served as youth pastor in inner cities of St. Louis, Missouri, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and Harlem. He authored the critically acclaimed Urban Souls, which takes a refreshing approach to the spiritual crisis in America. Recognizing his distinguished work as public scholar, the Institute for Policy Studies of the United States' oldest multi-issue progressive think tank in D.C., appointed Reverend Seku as the first associate fellow in religion and justice in 2006. Currently, Reverend Seku serves as senior community minister at Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village. He studied continental philosophy at the New School University and is currently studying theology and ethics at Union Theological Seminary. Mariama White Hammond was born in Boston, the child of two preacher doctors. She grew up with an understanding that God calls us all to serve our fellow man. Mariama's activism began in high school and continued at Stanford University, where Mariama was involved in campus politics and in the arts. She majored in international relations, focusing on political participation in developing nations and the role of capitalism in encouraging or discouraging democratic participation. During her junior year, she studied in Chile at La Universidad de Chile and at La Universidad Católica. In September, 2001, she came back to Boston and became executive director of Project Hip Hop, Highways into the Past, History, Organizing, and Power. Excuse me, an organization she had been involved with since high school. Project Hip Hop is a youth-led organization that engages young people in critical thinking, artistic production, and community organizing. It's currently working on issues ranging from breaking down territorial boundaries in Lower Roxbury to challenging disproportionate military recruiting in urban schools, promoting female artists who address the gender imbalance in hip-hop culture. She is a poet, singer, dancer, amateur hip-hop historian. In 2005, she accepted her call to the preaching ministry. While this role is not what Mariama would have seen for her life as a teenager, she believes that in the struggle for justice, there is a desperate need for those who will speak prophetically. Her hope is particularly to challenge the Christian church to embrace a more radical understanding of the life and mission of Jesus Christ. She is currently going through the 5-year process for ordination in the AME Church. She's also involved with a number of organizations in hip-hop and justice, including American Friends Service Committee's Critical Breakdown, the South End Lower Roxbury Youth Workers Alliance, the Union for Minority Neighborhoods, and Clergy and Laity Concerned with Iraq. Emmett G. Price III is quickly rising as one of the nation's leading experts on bridging the generational divide. A well-regarded musician, educator, and consultant, he actively researches, lectures, and writes about music of the United States, mainly with a focus on African American music, and while highlighting issues of social, political, economic, cultural, and religious concern. He is a noted print and broadcast media expert on African American music and culture, hip-hop culture, and youth culture. He's born and raised in Los Angeles. And got his BA in music from University of California, Berkeley, and both an MA and PA in music from the a PhD in music from the University of Pittsburgh. He's the author of Hip Hop Culture, Reaching Generation Y, Hip Hop Youth Culture and the Generational Divide, and the editor of The Black Church, Hip Hop Culture and the Dilemma of the Generational Divide. He's also the executive editor of the Encyclopedia of African American Music, a 3-volume comprehensive resource published by Greenwood Press. He is also on the faculty of Northeastern University, and he is a licensed minister and serves on the ministerial staff of the Greater Framingham Community Church as minister of music and worship. Apple Jacks, who's a performer, he's not on the stage, but he's performing later, is also with us. In 1999, he caught a performance by Grammy-nominated and 6-time Stellar Award winner Tonex. Tone? I just love hip-hop. You know, it ends with an X, don't say it. It's just like, work with me. Okay. And West Coast rap group Camp 8. The one gig provided all the motivation that needed to spark his hip-hop journey. Quote, "My approach to music is to impact culture with quality music that can change lives." He's a student of the art form and industry. Graduated from Campbell University in North Carolina in 2004 with a degree in music in business administration. And we look forward to his performance this evening, and we'll talk about it in more detail as we get closer to it. I wanted to read that, even though you have it, to give you a sense of this is a serious panel who have been engaged in a number of the issues that we're talking about this evening for a long time. And what I would like to start off doing with them is to do something that they may not really be that happy about, but it's more freestyle in terms of just to start off with them each saying something, because then we'll each talk for 10 minutes. But I want you to just get the flavor of the interest of the panel and in relation especially to some of the questions that those at Harambe have. And their questions are like this. We're talking about popular music and religion. But are we really able to make religion popular music? Is there some sort of contradiction? Is there a separation? Are there regional differences? For example, in a place like Chicago, on the most popular music stations associated with the black community, you always expect to hear religious music too. It's odd if there's no gospel music with everything else. But you can have gospel music that's following something that's pretty raw in many cases. And so what does all that mean to us? And I'd like to start off that asking that question initially of Emmett Price, who would later talk about those kinds of issues. But how do you respond to those kinds of issues, and how do you deal with that when you're talking to various groups?
Well, that's a great question. It's a very interesting question and perplexing, because if you look at the history of gospel music is almost, when we look at the incarnation of black gospel music in the 1920s, it's always been popular music. It was recorded, it was published, and it was sold. And so we kind of get into the territory of how do we distinguish what popular music is in terms of terminology. Thomas Andrew Dorsey was getting thrown out of churches because this stuff was so popular. As a matter of fact, Thomas Andrew Dorsey was the musical director for Gertrude Ma Rainey, who was the epitome of blues during that period in the 1920s. And so we have this notion of sacred and secular music. Well, it's ironic that gospel music has sacred lyrics on secular musicality, if you want to deal with it, because nobody stops playing the way that they did here and transfers and plays this way. So there are some unique secular sensibilities about gospel music, which is what's so addicting about it. And you take it up a little bit later, 1970s, and James Cleveland, who's taken jazz harmony arrangements and blues harmony arrangements and puts that on the gospel choir. And so when we get to the notion of the gospel choir, there's a different tone and texture in the way we utilize our voices in 4-part harmony, which doesn't sound like a Bach chorale. And so there, again, the notion of popular. And of course, you bring it up to the late 80s and 90s, Kirk Franklin, who's getting thrown out of churches as well, because his stuff, has a backbeat on it. And so there is this unique tension that goes not only in religious music or church music, if you will, but even down to hip-hop culture, where there is this dichotomy which is almost superficial. Because the music is inherently popular. The moment that you record it and sell it, it becomes popular music.
And Lady Grace, so how do you talk about the contemporary state of black religious and gospel music within that particular kind of context?
I think that Kanye West kind of broke the mold as far as the industry always saying that you can't say the name of Jesus over the airwaves and, it can never be a single. It'll never become popular. And, when that happened, he just opened the floodgates for everything else to come in. I, as a mobile DJ, I work more on Christian hip-hop and reggae, and I've been very blessed to have the opportunity to DJ all over the country. And the things that I find is that, right now, Christian hip-hop is no longer 10 years behind the rest of the industry like it used to be in its beginning. And unfortunately, again, because of industry standards, it's still not making the popular airways, although if it did, people would like it. So it's more about, the powers that be that are still controlling it. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, I absolutely. And in relation to that, I'd like actually, and anybody, if I'm not asking you the question, you want to respond to that particular question, please feel free to do so. This is for actually 3 people on the panel. It's Miriama, Reverend Sekou, and Miriam Whiteham, and Reverend Sekou, and Miriam Sharif. And this is, so we have all that happening in music. And then we have efforts of religious institutions and social organizations to stay relevant to youth. And we know that there are a lot of contradictions and a lot of things that you can grab onto that work, and a lot of things that may or may not be something that you want to represent. How do you handle that, or how do you contextualize those kinds of things within your particular practice?
I think, let's see, in terms of hip-hop, there are a lot of social justice organizations, youth-based organizations that are using hip-hop throughout the country. And it does look different depending on where it is. The groups in the South have a slightly different context. Out west, particularly in the Bay, they have a slightly different context. But in terms of using hip-hop as a way to connect with young people, I think a lot of organizations such as my own, the folks that run it, we're not too far in age. I mean, I'm more and more further in age from the young people I work with. But when I started, I was 22, and, most of my teams were, 16, 17. So we weren't too far apart in age. I think that the disconnect that I see is, and it's interesting because I think it's actually been really highlighted by Barack Obama's candidacy, is there's a huge disconnect, I think, between, particularly in the black community, between young black folks and older black folks. And I find that same disconnect in terms of our organizations. And so a group like Project Hip Hop and a group like the Urban League, and I'm not saying that specific to the Urban League in Boston, but just as an example, when you look at who shows up to our stuff and what we're talking about and what we're doing, there's just some distance there. I was recently at a gathering, and there's been just a lot of conflict about how does this generation engage with the civil rights movement generation in a way that we can all move together, because I think at essence we care about some of the same issues. But the language and the approach is sometimes different enough that we have a hard time pulling it together. So I think hip hop is only experiencing what other things in the larger community and context are also doing.
I hear you. Yes.
My response is to popular music and religion, and can religious music go pop through hip-hop. And I think that, Islamically speaking, that through hip-hop, Quranic ideas and concepts are deduced to the simplest level. And there isn't a sacred versus a secular, because for Muslim hip-hop artists, this is a form of worship. And this would be the only forum where Muslims can talk about God and not get in trouble.
All right.
The question for me becomes, what is the standard by which we are judging questions of relevancy and the nature of organizing, particularly the way in which to encounter young people, to engage them in particular my own location, the life of the church. And so that standard for me, I hang on Matthew 25:35, such what you have done unto the least of these, so you have done it unto me. I hang my sheer existence on that question and on that proclamation in which Jesus, one of the rare instances where Jesus gives penalty for not obeying. And so I'm going to hold hip-hop to that same standard. I'm going to hold the NAACP to that same standard. I'm going to hold all religious institutions and ideologies to that same standard in terms of the way in which I judge, for the lack of a better word, the way in which it's going to be engaging. I had an interesting, when teaching this course on preaching, the actual name of our course is The Art of Preaching, The Art of Prophetic Preaching in the Urban Context. And I had to make a decision. Would I train pastors to basically how to relate to young people in terms of giving them the lyrics, some of the terminology, which is always moving, in terms of what are the kind of hip things, who are the great artists, what are the movies they need to be watching in terms of relate to their young people? Or would I train them with the resources and the skills in order to engage this generation in the prophetic tradition? And that's a different standard versus like saying we got a cool church that does praise and worship. Right. That's a different standard. It's different than, having a dance, a liturgical dance ministry. And all of that is fine for folks who do that, right? I'm saying that the standard that we must hold hip-hop to is that how is it engaging the black freedom struggle, extending the democratic access for all human beings? And so that becomes a primary set of questions for me. Now, how to do that, I am unsure, and have had some limited success.
Thank you. And another question that I would love Yosef to respond to is the reality, and I think it really is the nice sort of closing question for the panel right now before they begin their talks, is the reality of religious diversity and the field of religious studies in and of itself, and how that works, especially in relation to hip-hop.
Sure. I guess piggybacking on what Brother Sekou has said, on one hand, I think he points to the fact that there's a certain shared sensibilities across culture, right? So culture is this contradictory space, whether it be religion, whether it be hip-hop, what have you. And on another hand, he resists the fetishization of hip-hop culture. And yet, while turning to that for our conversation today, I think one of the things that's led to religious studies late coming to the analysis of hip-hop is the fact that it's often simply conflated with gangster rap or with what are seen as hip-hop's most basic elements, right? The misogyny, the sexism, the violence, what have you. Even while many of those elements are present in our churches and our mosques or what have you, right? But at the same time, it's led to hip-hop being overlooked. It's typically being defined as profane or secular, what have you. But all those elements are there alongside of the same types of theological questions that are asked and engaged in our religious communities proper.
Fabulous. Thank you. Now, there are three questions. I'm just going to, other questions I just want to read to you because I want the panelists to hear them. So as they're talking, they might think about contextualizing some of them that were asked. Can hip-hop serve as a relevant spiritual and theoretical device in cultural context? Can it function as an agent of change, which was raised here in particular cultural class and or social structure? And does hip-hop have a prophetic or idolatrous, I always say that wrong, voice? Okay. Now, the reason why I wanted the panel to do this way for a second is because the people at the students at Harambe have worked really hard, and these are things that they're very passionate about, these questions. And I wanted to make sure we spoke about that. All of us on this panel are talkers and can talk for days, and we like it. We like to hear each other, and we like to hear ourselves, quite frankly. But we also want to be able to hear you, and we want to represent you, because hip-hop is about representing. It's not just about, preaching our stuff. It's really about this exchange. And so each panelist has a maximum of 10 minutes. I'm not going to do the signs because these are really, really incredible speakers, and they wouldn't pay attention to 5 minutes. It would just be they'll stop when it's clear they're going to stop. I would like the panelists so each person will decide how much of their 10 minutes they want to do, how much they want to engage, and go back and forth. But let's what we really want to do is to have a flow and get as much out as possible. And I'll do my best as the moderator to help everyone, make sure that they're able to do what they came to do, as well as find out those things. So we're going to do it in the order as it stands now that appears on the program itself. And so we're going to start with DJ Lady Grace. Okay.
Good evening. Now picture this. You make $1 million, bank account fat. Then the next day, what do you know? The stock market collapse. There's riots, little kids dying in the street, cannibalism, people eating human being meat. There's no more Yankees, no more Lakers, no more Knicks, cats raping chicks, no more spending dough on tricks. Missiles flying, tanks crush your navigators. While this is going on, nobody cares if you're a player. The earth is shaking, The Statue of Liberty drops. Bloods and Crips die as the earth swallows your block. You're not laughing. You're looking serious like Spock. There's too much happening. You about to go into a shock. Right now, as the earth is going into pieces, you thinking, my God, should I give my life to Jesus? Today is your day for salvation. Repent and believe the gospel because we live in Revelation. And that's by my brother Corey Red. As I was thinking about really how to expound on this topic tonight, what God really put on my mind was, how does religious sensibility contribute to the genocide of the hip-hop generation? Back in October, I was watching this new reality show on VH1 called The Salt and Pepper Show, which some of y'all might have watched. I kind of got addicted to that. It was a really good show, you know. And for those of you who weren't able to watch it, basically, Salt and Pepper was a very popular all-female rap group back in the mid-1980s, and the group broke up because Cheryl Salt James walked out. She had, for personal reasons, one of them being is that she became a Christian. And so what this reality show is about is, you know, explores the possibility if they can become a group again. And it's this whole conflict of them trying to be a group without Salt having to compromise her Christian values. And so in the first episode, as I'm watching this, you know, they're doing their rehearsal, and you know, Pepper's on stage, and she's getting ready to give this guy a lap dance, and Salt gets upset, and she pulls her to the side, and she's just like, you know, she goes, this is what I'm talking about. So you see what I'm saying? She goes, I can't do this. She goes, the fact that I'm even here is a compromise. And I was saying, that's very interesting. And, you know, I was like, why did you do the show in the first place? You know? And so the scene goes on, you know, in this episode, and she's you know, you just see the worry on her face and the stress, and I'm getting stressed sitting on the couch. I'm like, you don't have to do this. And she has a prayer group that comes to her house, and she's there for a prayer group, and she's crying, and yeah, she got the tissues, and she's like, I'm in this dilemma. She goes, you know, I'm trying to get the group back together, but I don't want to compromise my Christian values. And I want to show you the comment that one of the members of her prayer group said, with good intentions, and I may need a little help with this PowerPoint as far as how to just turn it. Okay. Oh, great. Okay, here it is. This is the comment from one of the members in her prayer group. Now, Cheryl is Salt. She says, you can still do this, Cheryl. She goes, it's not 10 years ago, and you can go out there and be on stage and touch so many lives and still have that comfort zone of the good place you still are now. I know you can do it. We know you can do it. And after she said that, see, I'm watching this on demand. I paused it. I took off my socks and I threw it at the TV because I didn't want to, you know, throw anything hard at my TV to break it. And I'm like, I don't believe this. And I called one of my friends on the phone. I was like, hey, you know, have you seen the new Salt and Pepper reality show? I was like, it's a compromise. I was like, why can't she understand that she doesn't have to do this? And so, you know, one of the problems, you know, there's an epidemic with secular artists doing, you know, religious songs and then turning around and doing other songs about sex, drugs, cars, you know, all these different things. And after watching this episode, I just started to think, I was like, man, you know, what is the root of this problem? You know, where did all of this come from? You know, because now it's just snowballing. More and more people seem to be comfortable doing both gospel and secular. And one of the things that the scripture that God brought to my mind was this one. How'd I go? Here we go. It says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common, or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? What does a non-believer have in common with an unbeliever? Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. And so first, you know, that was the first thing he showed me in regards to Salt and Pepper's relationship. And I was like, man, if I could have been in that prayer group to share that verse with her, it's like, you don't have to do this, sister. But going back, again, the root of this problem, of this epidemic of artists doing both gospel and secular, actually comes from the church. Most of these artists came from the church. You see, in the church, especially, when they're growing up, I find that they learn more of the religious rituals and less of the relationship. They were never taught really the essentials of the Christian faith. If they were, they would have found this scripture. Am I hitting the right button again? You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred towards God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or maybe this one. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And I have my 2 minutes. I can't expound too much further here, but just to wrap all of this up, how this sensibility contributes to the genocide of the hip-hop generation is the fact that these artists do not see a contradiction between doing gospel and secular, because the church never taught them any of the essentials of the Christian faith. They don't know the word. And if they did, they would, they would feel some kind of conviction towards it. And therefore, they continue to create even more and more of these songs that leads to this genocide. Can you pass me that flyer right there? Next one over, underneath her paper. This was a flyer that I had passed out. Okay. That you were coming in, that you can look at, and it just goes over the genocidal statistics that the secular gospel music industry is contributing to. That is my time. I'm going to be obedient and get off. Thank you.
Next is Yosef, I believe is next on the list. Oh, it's Miriam? Oh, I'm looking at it wrong. I must have an old one. Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay, Miriam, you're after him.
Sure. Why not? Good evening. Okay, that's fine. That's great. Good evening, everyone. I have a manuscript, so I'm going to try to stick to it. It should keep me under 10 minutes. My argument today is straightforward. I want to suggest that attention to the spiritual evolution of KRS-One helps to map a broader pattern in hip-hop from the 1980s to the present moment. Most concisely, as rap music, which today I'll use interchangeably with the term hip-hop, as rap music moved to the center of mainstream popular culture, its most prominent religious sensibilities have simultaneously shifted from Islam to Christianity. KRS-One, a solo MC who began rapping in the mid-'80s as part of the group Boogie Down Productions, which included such albums as Criminal Minded and By All Means Necessary, a clear reference to Malcolm X. In fact, on the album's cover figures a picture of KRS-One holding an Uzi, looking out of the window, clearly trying to conjure that classic photo of Malcolm X with his shotgun in tow as he peers out the window to see who might be coming for him and his family. In more recent years, however, KRS-One has recorded music that is of more specifically religious nature, most obviously with his 2002 Spiritually Minded album, which displays an employment of explicitly Christian lyrics. The songs on Spiritual Minded continue KRS-One's earlier critique of the American mainstream, but they also specifically address such issues as the sacredness of virginity, the importance of cultivating a, quote, Christ consciousness, and the necessity of being born again. Along this journey from criminal minded to spiritual minded, KRS-One has moved from affiliations with New York's Riverside Church, that bastion of liberal Protestantism, to Barbara L. King's International Truth Center in Atlanta, grounded in American New Thought traditions, and on to Clarence McClendon's Full Harvest International Church in California, a multicultural congregation grounded in contemporary charismatic movements. Thinking towards a religious history of hip-hop, the most obvious influence has been Islam, which in its various forms, whether Sunni, Nation of Islam, or 5%er, have been ubiquitous to the music. Too many artists have professed allegiance to any of these traditions to provide an even near complete list here. Interestingly enough, what appeared to bind these artists together was not so much a particular Islamic orthodoxy per se, but rather it was the rootedness in the cultural repertoires of the African diaspora and the experience of primarily black and brown youth in the United States that appeared to offer some coherence to an otherwise heterodox collection of Muslim spiritualities. Amidst the public resurgence of black nationalist sensibilities, most visibly in events such as the Million Man March and Spike Lee's biopic of Malcolm X, sort of blacker the berry rationale ordered the religious indices of hip-hop culture during the late 80s and early 90s. Within this framework, Islam represented a greater degree of alterity and perceived authenticity for righteous young black folk. One recalls the countless rappers, most notably Guru of the group Gang Starr in his 1989 video I Manifest, who tried to conjure Malcolm X standing behind pulpits with kufis adorning their heads. However, the religious dimensions of hip-hop have evolved from this neo-nationalist Islamic black spirituality to a celebration of a Christian gospel of bling, evidenced in the affinity of rappers towards today's black prosperity preachers. Additionally, in today's scene, Islam is no longer perceived as a necessarily oppositional discourse. Talk of black gods has moved from the mouths of Muslims to the tongues of hip-hop moguls like Jay-Z, for whom the 5% lexicon represents but one religious constellation in a universe of words. In fact, even Lupe Fiasco, hip-hop's most recent Muslim MC of choice, nods his head in the direction of Christianity, giving shout-outs to gospel music stars Yolanda Adams and Smokey Norfolk and the Atlanta-based megachurch pastor Creflo Dollar. On the chorus to his underground single entitled Muhammad Walks, a remix of the famous Kanye West track, Lupe raps, quote, "I'm not trying to profit off the prophet, so this one's for free." He released his single over the internet. More significantly, references to Creflo Dollar, who is arguably the most popular black prosperity preacher today, have become a fixture in hip-hop music. They include a cameo appearance in Ludacris and Jermaine Dupri's Welcome to Atlanta video, an acknowledgement in verse by 50 Cent, and a professed affiliation by now Minister Mace. Within hip-hop, Christianity has become as much a signifier of wealth and power as it is evidence of any specific theological vision. Or perhaps many rappers bear witness to a theology that valorizes wealth as divine blessing, which of course is, to quote Dead Prez, bigger than hip-hop. Pastor Dollar, for whom wealth is indeed a core spiritual value, seems to embody for many rappers the essence of hip-hop's hustle doused in holy water. Of note, Dollar has his own music video in the works, performed by a group of rappers who belong to his church and record label. The song's refrain is simply, quote, "Money, money, coming down," end quote. Hip-hop's rising Christendom culminated in 2003 with the release of Kanye West's Jesus Walks. However, this song was perhaps an exception to the rule of conflating Christianity with social capital. West preached a deeply personal piety, explaining, quote, "I ain't here to argue about his facial features or here to convert atheists into believers. I'm just saying the way school needs teachers, the way Kathy Lee needed Regis, that's the way I need Jesus," end quote. Yet he also proclaimed, right? While we like the Kathy Lee line, there's also a clear critique of black theology, right? God's facial features don't matter anymore. Yet he also proclaimed the theology of the oppressed and outcast, as the song's chorus insisted that Jesus walked most closely with murderers, strippers, and drug dealers. Surprisingly, he provided a rather nuanced vision of contemporary American Christianity, so much so that he felt the song required 3 separate music videos, of which I won't detail now. But Kanye also bowed to prosperity preachers, inviting Mace, now a Creflo Dollar protege, to offer a prayer at the end of the remix, in which Mace claimed, quote, "I'm saved, I'm healed, I'm rich," end quote. However, in contrast to the complexities of American Christianity portrayed by Kanye West, I want to point to an example more typical of hip-hop's religious aesthetic. Jeffrey Atkins, a.k.a. Ja Rule, who was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, frequently worked religious references into his music when he topped the charts at the turn of the 21st century. Did this most obviously when he named his triple platinum selling album Rule 336, a not-so-subtle signification on Christian scripture, in which the CD cover reworked that gospel passage, John 3:36, writing, quote, "He who believes in Jah shall have everlasting life. He who does not shall not see life, but the wrath of my vengeance. Pain is love," end quote. However, a song that best captures the way Christianity often functions in rap music is a duet Ja Rule recorded in 2002 with Ashanti entitled Always on Time. As the song moved towards the end, Rule's plea was simple, quote, "Believe me, this pimp game is very religious," end quote. Throughout the song, Rule celebrates his sexual prowess, but the song's title and chorus signified on that popular black Christian adage, quote, "He may not come when you want him, but he's always on time," end quote. The Chorus to Rules version sung by Ashanti went something to the effect of, I'm not always there when you call, but I'm always on time. We can infer from his use of the term religious that Ja Rule intended to convince his listeners just how seriously he took the business of dominating women. While Big Daddy Kane admitted years ago that, quote, pimping ain't easy, for Ja Rule, evidently, it's an ultimate concern. I want to quickly point out two things about Ja Rule's pairing of the rhetorics of pimp and religion. First, this general partnering of religion and male sexual power subtly supports the privileging of Christianity. Specifically, his use of a black Christian musical refrain reveals power dynamics that privilege Christianity as religious authority, even when it is not explicitly invoked. Second, with regards to gender, it is important to point out that at the same time that Ja Rule invoked Christianity, that it was Ashanti's voice on the chorus revising the black church refrain that made possible this very profitable crossover career. More generally, and to mix metaphors, all too often it has been black women's bodies that become the bread, meaning money, for male MCs. My hope here is simply to draw attention to the way in which Christianity often functions as a symbolic resource in sort of a hip-hop gender politic in which the public feasts on and male rappers profit off of the bodies and blood of black women. An image that could be unpacked for religious meaning. Of course, I want to avoid the trap of painting a picture solely from the voices of male rappers' perspectives. Women have checked this conversation throughout. But I want to just quickly, in closing, move and take a quick look at Remy Ma's most recent album. She is perhaps the most recent example and perhaps the first woman in a tradition of rappers, including Tupac, Diddy, and Nas, who've experimented with the iconography of the old rugged cross. In the trailer for her most recent album entitled, quote, Jesus Christ, Remy Ma appeared on the cross with a crown of thorns rapping, quote, if Jay-Z's Jehovah and Nas is God's son, and I was spitting crack so the people would die, son, and then I came back, but I never left nice, I'm the BX Savior, Jesus Christ. C-Pun told them she's so nice that when it comes to the pen, she was like some of the greatest of men that she would write. Now I'm the BX Savior, Jesus Christ. In a peculiar synthesis of hip-hop's gender politic, Remy on one hand usurps masculine power by citing her endorsement from Fat Joe, while her posture on the cross accents her curvaceous figure. Rapping, quote, like some of the greatest of men while draping her body across the cross, she both seduces male listeners and seizes power typically perceived to belong to male rappers. In the end, though, Remy Ma makes her point abundantly clear. Hopes for a black feminist critique of hip-hop's misogyny aside, Jesus' talk is often meant simply to clarify just who has the juice. In this short litany of MCs from KRS-One to Remy Ma, we are provided with a rather rich vision of the multiple ways black artists engage and are shaped by the American religious landscape. Ultimately, at a moment when many artists bear witness to the persistent appeal ultimately at a moment when Christianity has reemerged at the center of American political and popular culture, many artists bear witness to the persistent appeal of a version of Christianity that reinforces a specific set of gender and sexuality norms and uncritically celebrates the unbridled acquisition of cultural capital, social power, and financial prosperity. All qualities that more often than not have led to hip-hop music being overlooked, typically described as not religious, certainly secular, and quite often profane. Thank you.
Mariam Sharif.
Sorry, I just have to start out with, I'm going to be mad at Yosef because he stole one of my lines.
Sorry.
We had to take a pass.
Okay. I greet you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. From the last poets to Mos Def and Q-Tip, Islam and hip-hop have had a long relationship, primarily because of the oral tradition of Islam, spoken word, and it has been an attractant to the expression of hip-hop. But another appealing aspect of hip-hop is its ability to express revolutionary, anti-establishment rhetoric in poetic form. As in many religious traditions that are concerned with orthopraxy, the idiom of music can be an iffy topic. Within the Muslim community, some say that music is halal or permissible, and some say that it falls under the category of haram or not permissible. The surprising thing is that the hip-hop community has been exceptionally embracing of Islam and is not judgmental, as one would find in the other areas of the entertainment business, whether it be the use of Muslim names, terms, or concepts. Muslims in sports make it out without scrutiny. For example, Muhammad Ali and Hakeem Olajuwon, etc. But most stuff doesn't cross over in other areas of society. In the hip-hop community, regardless of dress, race, or ethnicity, beard wearing or scarf donning, there is a support and welcomeness. But in the mainstream music, ethos or pop music, try being a Muslim woman in hijab covering like myself. It would not be allowed, accepted, or even recognized. That is unless it was in Erykah Badu rap. It looks more cultural. And I'm sure even she had her own challenges. Now we have a well-known Muslim hip-hop artist, Talib Kweli, who features cameos of a Muslim woman wearing niqab or a face veil in his MTV premiered video entitled Get By, which I'm trying to play a clip of from the computer in the back. So that was a brief picture of the lady in niqab. In their lyrics, now we have then we have non-Muslim rap artists and neo-soul and spoken word artists who have entire verses from the Quran, such as Lauryn Hill and Jill Scott. In their lyrics, there is an implied knowledge. When Islamic terms are used in hip-hop, people don't translate it. It's just understood. With Lauryn Hill, I don't know if it's because she grew up in New Jersey and people are familiar with Muslims in New Jersey. By the way, I'm from New Jersey. Especially the places where she mentions in her song. And we're going to need to switch back to the other computer. So this is from her album Miseducation. And I forgot that in several of her songs there was a reference to Islam or some names or nomenclature that she uses, and she doesn't explain it, you just know. Of course, while I'm looking for that. So here, she mentions, I makes a lot like a Sunni, in reference to Sunni Muslims. And sorry for any curses that you see me scroll by. And the other one is taking too long to find. But her her lyrics in the Miseducation is very filled with terms that are, here's another one where, and everybody's name was a Muslim. And also she talks about in another song about Deen. So in these lyrics, there's an implied knowledge, and with Lauryn Hill, she presents those in her lyrics. She knows that her music is worldwide. It has a worldwide listening audience. Not only is her music globally accepted, it is understood and it's integrated into the culture. The television show, The West Wing, can't come off without a translation in American cultural terms, or Aliens in America. And there's my little prayer time thing popping up. Okay. I just want to play a little small clip of Jill Scott's song. YouTube. And this song is from A Long Walk. Oh, and we can't hear it.
Situation, temptation, education, relaxation, elevation. Maybe we can talk about Surah 31:18.
In here, Jill Scott, she mentions Surah 31:18. Which I had to make sure I looked up, which is the chapter of Luqman. The explicit translation. Here is, and swell not thy cheek for pride at man, nor walk in insolence through the earth, for Allah loveth not an arrogant boaster. The Muslim rap artists Lupe Fiasco and Rhymefest had a candid, heated discussion on a media website about the Democratic candidates Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. In this discussion, they were clearly using words that were Islamic in nature, and no one in the audience said, "We don't understand you," or "We don't know what you're saying." It was not translated, and they were able to speak openly. They were talking about Allah and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and no one was like, "What is this Muslim stuff?" or concentrating on the fact that they were Muslim. So there is this acceptance in the hip-hop entertainment industry of Islam and Muslims. There is this relationship going on that demonstrates that Islam is well integrated in the hip-hop community. So Lupe Fiasco makes that song, Muhammad Walks, that has become a hit on YouTube, and it was free because he didn't want to profit off of the prophet, Yosef. Coincidentally, this song has the same beat as Kanye West's Jesus Walks, which was produced by the Muslim artist Talib Kweli. And there was no contradiction because he believes that Jesus is a prophet. There is a Muslim hip-hop artist website, and I just want you to note that on this website, it's called muslimhiphop.com, that there are ladies. So there are Muslim women rappers, Misunderstood from Brooklyn, Ms. Latifa, and we have a Kurdish Iraqi sister, Sister Hayero. This is muslimhiphop.com. So some of these ladies are covered in full hijab and others who have alternative modes of covering. Finally, I'd like to briefly touch upon hip-hop's influence on Muslims globally. In 1996, there was a group of North Africans living in the ghetto in France. They had a block party featuring rap artists rapping about their plight in the inner city of France and using it as an outlet to express their discontent with France. Recently, Suad Abu Kabir, a Princeton PhD candidate, just returned from Morocco doing research on hip-hop in Morocco. Also, we have a
an establishment of Warbucks Records, which is a Muslim hip-hop artist recording studio. It's independent to hip-hop record companies. And they have founded their company on 5 pillars, 5 elements. They feel that hip-hop music has been misconstrued in a manner analogous to Islam. Hip-hop is often misunderstood to the peril of those that constitute that very community. Commercial rap music has been mistaken as hip-hop music, and the mainstream media has exacerbated this misconception and exploited this ignorance. This undermines and degrades hip-hop by ignoring its quintessential elements. Hip-hop is a culture that consists of 5 elements that are essential in depicting our histories of struggle. Therefore, we are bridging the 5 pillars of Islam with the 5 elements of hip-hop to create a proactive platform to depict the social and political inequity that is far too rampant domestically and globally. So the next time you stroll through Paterson, New Jersey, and you wonder why those 6 Palestinians are on the corner rapping in Arabic, just remember they have embraced hip-hop, and hip-hop has embraced Islam.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Our next speaker is Reverend Sekou.
I want to just first say thank you to Chandra for her pulling us all together. She had the unfortune of being an intern of mine at the Institute for Policy Studies, and looks like she turned out all right in spite of being split between myself and the great Marcus Raskin, the founder of the Institute for Policy Studies. I also see a few of my friends, Stephen Rockwell from the Institute for Progressive Christianity, of which I've been a very bad board member. Brother Foreman has drove down from New York City to be with us. He's a psychoanalyst, and so I got an appointment. And Joseph, you may need to come in after. I do. And as well as Maya is a rabbinical student at Hebrew College and is engaging in the tremendous task of being a rabbi at this particular moment, given all that is happening in Israel. And then I also want to lift up Frances Kissling, the former president of Catholics for a Free Choice. For 25 years, she engaged the Catholic establishment around a woman's right to choose. In that, signing one of the documents that her organization put out, I was managed to be banned from the Vatican. So thank you, Frances. But I want to begin with that frame of thinking about what does it mean to rail against religious establishment as a religious being. There are 3 perennial questions that haunt my own work. Those perennial questions are, how do we end human misery? The second question being, how do humans make meaning for themselves in light of that misery, not of their own choosing? And the third of that perennial question is, what does this generation, our situatedness, to use the Sartrean concept, our circumstance, if you will, this generation, have to teach us about meaning making as we attempt to engage in being religious beings? And those 3 perennial questions are undergirded by two dialogical assumptions. Those dialogical assumptions are, religion is primarily a meaning-making activity. It is the way in which humans define themselves. And that so then, inside a pluralistic democratic society, democracy is primarily a space, it creates space, if you will, for humans to make meaning for themselves vis-a-vis its political, social, and economic structures. And so understanding that as the kind of frame and the undercurrent of my question of the consideration of hip-hop as a meaning-making activity, I have attempted to begin to think about hip-hop as a kind of religion. I was privileged to serve as the chair of the platform committee at the National Political Hip Hop Convention in 2004. And at one of the panels, we had an intergenerational dialogue that ultimately became the intergenerational argument. But I began to talk about the question of religion, and given the fact of who we are generationally, our variety of exposures to a variety of religious traditions, that many young people's primary site of engagement and socialization is not the church, but it's often peer group is the primary form of socialization. Many have been exposed to a variety of forms of religion. And given the level of disgrace among religious leaders and the dysfunction of the black church and its petty bourgeois sensibilities inside urban communities, whereby the vast majority of these religious institutions who have historically served communities now are commuter communities in which people drive into church, stay there 2, 3, and I'm Pentecostal 4, 5, 6 hours, and then go home. And so those spaces are not the historic anchor spaces that they've historically been. And so young people are righteous in their indignation and in their suspicion of religious institutions. And so the vast majority of young people say this, that I am not religious, I am. This is a generational mantra. It is about a critique of the decline of religion and the power and prowess of the black church, and it's already been laid out that power and prowess of the black church has diminished. Therefore, Islam gets a new kind of rhythm and life inside our communities, in part because the presence of the Nation of Islam on street corners around this country. That their sheer presence inside of our communities, the historic work of the Nation of Islam and Honorable Elijah Muhammad with all of his contradictions, inside these communities, engaging young people, being present, and their work around gangs inside a variety of housing projects. I do believe they did work here in Boston. And so this ideal of being spiritual but not religious, in fact, is a critique of the black church and is a critique of mainline religion and its failure to engage young people and to grow. And so then what has emerged out of this spirituality is a kind of Baiduism, if you will. That Erykah Badu's first album represents a watershed moment in articulating a postmodern religious identity among young people, because what it represents is a kind of eschatological hope of young people in lighter circumstances, not of their own choosing, meaning that they are engaging in religious sensibilities as they attempt to make some sense out of the deindustrialization of the city, the rise of the prison industrial complex, and the sheer failure of inner city schools and the variety of contradictions that they face. And so with that in mind as the frame, I want to lift up a kind of model again as I began, in which how are we going to judge religious sensibilities of hip hop? Now my colleagues here have a lot more faith in hip hop than I do. While I've written about it, I believe in it and bounce my head to it. That my lack of faith in its capacity is that capacity has to, the reason why hip hop has the saliency, the reason why we're even having a conversation about hip hop is because there's so many, all the other infrastructures around young people have collapsed and it is all that they have. Talk. And so because of the collapse of these infrastructures around young people, it gets lifted up. And so then it becomes, there's a discourse around saying that there's a hip hop movement. Movements are recorded by historians. They are not articulated by people who are participating in the activity at that time. And so then the question for us becomes, what is the standard that hip hop is going to be judged by? Let me begin with an old big black woman, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth says, children, God talks to me. Children, God talk to me. I tell you that children, God talk to me. God took me up and showed me some wheat. And I saw that wheat and I reached and grabbed hold of that wheat and there was no wheat there. And I asked God, what's wrong with this wheat? And God said, there's weevil in the wheat. What Sojourner Truth is talking about, that a weevil epidemic had invaded wheat crops within the Midwest and it looked like wheat, but when you grabbed it, it was not. Children, God talks to me. Children, God talks to me. I tell you, God talks to me. And I hear people talking about this Constitution standing proud and tall. But when I reach and grab hold to it for my rights, they ain't there. And I ask God, what's wrong with the Constitution? And God tells me, Sojourner, there's a little weevil in it. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments have not been passed. Sojourner Truth understood that God was concerned about her as a citizen inside a democracy that was denying her rights. And so then religion for Sojourner Truth was something that was about the expansion of democratic rights. And so then I want to argue for what I call a religious precedent for democratic expansion. That the religious institutions inside America, particularly Christianity, have always been used to engage in the expansion of democracy. So people use the Bible to justify slavery, and then there are those who use the Bible to participate in the Underground Railroad. In the case of Denmark V.C. Gabriel, Prosser Nat Turner, who engaged in armed struggle against the institution of slavery. There are people who use the Bible in order to justify denying a woman's right to vote, and there are people who use the Bible to expand it. Among them, Cathy Staton and those other great feminists. There are people who use the Bible and religious institutions to deny black people the right to vote, to justify segregation, as well as those who use it to participate in the civil rights movement. Roe v. Wade begins in a church basement with United Methodist women in Dallas, Texas. That they understood that the religious sensibilities required them to say that women were moral agents and they had a right to make a decision about their own bodies. The church that I serve now, Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village, we had an abortion clinic before abortion was legal. Because we understood that women were moral agents and had a moral and ethical opportunity and responsibility to choose the way in which they would engage in the production of life, and whether or not they would be choose to the domestic sphere, justified it out of a certain religious context. And so then I want the standard for hip hop to be judged by, within the framework of reading the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other, to be that does hip hop contribute to democratic expansion? And given the moment that we're in with the anti-terrorism acts that justify spying on American citizens, the fact that conversations are being recorded and corporations are participating in that recording of our conversations, the fact that there's an illegal, unwise, and immoral war going on in Iraq. If hip-hop can make a contribution to that question, to expanding the democratic opportunity, then I have not lost faith in it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mariama White Hammond.
Well, the danger of being close to the end is by the time you get here, many of your points have been taken. So I'm going to hopefully be able to close out in less than in my 10 minutes to create more space for questions. I think I started out by saying it's strange for me to actually be here on this panel, because while I am a minister and while I do run a hip hop organization, it has not yet come to pass that I've been able to reconcile those two things together. Not because I think they are unreconcilable, but in my effort to do so, I have found there are some challenges. But I want to go to the question that we were posed way back when this was conceived, and the question was, hip-hop, is it idolatry or prophecy? I thought it was interesting because I called my father, and he, asked to pick up my niece, honestly, today, because usually I pick her up from daycare. And it was interesting because when I posed the question, he said exactly what I had wanted to say, which is that it is both and. It is both idolatry and prophecy. It is an extreme demonstration of two large parts of the American tradition. One, of radical individualism. It's your thing. You do not have to be responsible for what your freedom does to other people. And it's also part of a long-standing tradition, most characterized by the song What's Going On, in terms of free speech and speaking truth to power. So while we are very apt to hold others accountable, we are not apt to hold ourselves accountable. And that is very much within the American tradition, and it's very much within the hip-hop tradition. The reality is that, to me, in a lot of ways, what we call hip-hop and what is, in essence, rap music is what we often boil hip-hop down to, is a reflection of the reality that so many black Americans have totally bought into the American dream, even though it may not help the majority of us. Now, I say this in the context of the reality that the majority of the consumers of hip-hop are actually white males between the age of 14 and 21, I believe. So they're actually the money behind hip-hop. But the reality is they like it because black people like it, and that has always been the tradition within American culture. So I say that because the question for me is, in my day-to-day work, and I know I was sort of brought here because I'm the sort of, I work with young people on a day-to-day basis person at the table. That's sort of my role, so I will cut to that, although there are many other things that I would love to say about hip-hop. I think when we look at hip-hop, there are two ways to look at it. One is within the cultural context of the reality that we see now, mostly within the, hip-hop culture, as you see on MTV and BET, who, while they do sponsor many hearings to talk about hip-hop, continue to play the same corrosive videos as everyone else. But because it's black people, we have to have, a teen summit to talk about it, and then the next program will be another set of horrible videos. Anyway, hip-hop is a cultural reality in America, but it also is a tool, and it is a powerful tool, I believe, and I see its power as a tool. I also see its negative effects. So I want to focus mostly on some of the positive pieces of the tool, because I know that you have heard many of the things about the negative side of hip-hop, and I could talk about that for an hour in and of itself. However, I think that hip-hop, what I see in my work is that it creates a space for young people to say things that they may not otherwise be able to say. I have young men come into my office and, clearly something is wrong. What's wrong? Nothing, right? But you get them down to write, and they're talking about everything that they've gone through. I remember we did an exercise with young people where we asked them to do an autobiographical study using hip-hop. We took every year of their life, and thankfully they're young enough that we could fit it all onto 2 sheets, and we had them talk about what was the worst and the best moment in their lives that year, and the song that they felt most captured that year for them. I think it was most depressing to me when the 2 young people in my group, we had them in groups of 5, recognized that their mothers had become addicted to crack in the same year, and they had both been taken out of the house by DSS in the same year. And while I was glad that they had an opportunity to bond over their shared struggle, it was pretty a depressing day for me, because it happened only 3 weeks after one of our young people had been stabbed and was unable to participate in the trip we were taking on that following Monday. He was with us on Saturday. He died on Tuesday. We left on Friday. But hip-hop does create a space as a tool for young people to talk about these issues. I think of the example of DMX, who, to be honest with you, I really do think he needs to see a clinician, because some of the things he talks about and his relationship, particularly with his dog, and not like his dogs, but his actual physical dog, to me is slightly unhealthy. But that being said, it does create a space for particularly black men to say things that they are experiencing that they are not able to say in other contexts. The same is true for the young women I work with, despite the reality that hip-hop has a double-edged sword for them. It can be a tool of liberation, while at the same time we recognize it as has been a tool of oppression. And so many of my young women write specifically about their right as women to live and exist and to be proud of who they are. So I hope that we are able to see hip-hop in its light. And one of the other things that we do in our work is that we use hip-hop as a tool to analyze everything from sexism to capitalism, which are not inherently exclusive, of course. Though we might say that they are, that it's always those people over there that are sexist because we're capitalist, democratic, and free. However, one of the things I find particularly interesting and challenging as our work grows is that because hip-hop has both a tradition of looking back to the past, because sampling is inherently looking to the past, and you take music that comes from before, it also has a very ahistorical tendency at times to believe that it created itself out of nothingness and exists unto itself. And so one of the first things I always tell young people is that hip-hop comes from a long tradition, and it did not make itself up. And yet, I continue to do workshops and find that in middle schools, it used to be if you did a Tupac quote, everybody knew it. In the past couple of months, I've been brought into 3 different middle schools in which young kids in the 8th grade, 6th through 8th grade, depending on the school, could not identify a Tupac quote. And so I was shocked. I mean, it kind of threw me off. I was like, I'm going to have to completely revise my standard workshop now. And it is hard for me to find content now when there are many songs that are no more than a chorus redone with a dance attached to it. So there's much less content at times for me to pull from that is popular. And so I do think I want us to push not just challenging hip-hop, but be creating a space for young people themselves to analyze hip-hop, and particularly in the context of the phrase keeping it real, which is one that we look at all the time. And so I'm going to close out by just saying that the reason that hip-hop, in my opinion, has beat out the church, not necessarily just because of the bling-bling, because you can certainly get that in church with our new prosperity philosophy, but that hip-hop, in theory, gives voice to young people, and the church just does not. And so I don't think that's an insurmountable obstacle, but it is one that the church will really have to deal with. Do we create space and give voice to the most oppressed? Clearly, we've had some problems with that, given that the majority of our leadership is male, while the majority of our congregants are female. But if we could begin to deal with that issue and create space for young people, then they could take this same powerful tool and begin to speak about new realities when they begin to experience new realities. So I hope we are able to engage as we talk more, but I do think that there is hope. I think there's more hope than my brother Sekou, but mostly because we look at the tool and not because we look at the current cultural context. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Professor Emmett Price.
I certainly thank my brothers and sisters for setting the tone. There's really not much I can say, but there is. In the new work that I'm working on, an anthology, which many of our panelists are participants in, introduction, I start by saying that if the church was vigilant to its mission, there would be no hip-hop culture. I'm going to let you wrestle with that for a second. When the first African was brought to this country as a slave, and they got to this place and put their foot on the land and made whatever sound they made, there was a recognition that something just isn't right here. And they looked to the person to the left and the person to their right and couldn't figure out how to communicate because they didn't all speak the same language. They didn't all come from the same place. And they too looked at one another and said, something just ain't right here. And one began to moan, and the other one began to sing. And somehow, with the notion of coming from different belief systems, different languages, different systems of cosmology, that voice and the passion, the rawness and the grit behind that voice allowed them to communicate such that we have a powerful repertoire of songs called the spirituals. Indeed, some would argue that the spirituals are all Christian based, but somewhere in one of those spirituals there was a song that said, heaven, heaven, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Heaven, heaven. Some kind of critique on this notion of those who say they are what they claim to be. We're going to leave that there. Spirituals end up going into two realms, as many historians falsely argue. Some would say they go a spiritual realm into what we call early religious music, and some would say they go into a secular realm, which ends up blues. Something ironic about this notion is that many blues singers of that period were called Reverend this and Reverend that. Many of them talked about heaven, God, Jesus even. And some of those who went the religious route didn't use God or Jesus and used some kind of symbology or synonyms for what was going on there. The interesting thing that from the ancestry, there was no separation nor segregation of this sacred or secular. You were who you were. As a matter of fact, we can almost argue that religion in its most simplistic term is a way of life. As you progress through the chronological spectrum of black music, if you will, or American music, if we want to be honest about it, you realize that there is something that is so dominant and prominent about this music. And there are three things that I can condense them down to. There are others. I would say one is hope, two is survival, and three is expression. These three things make the music so addictive that during World War II, you have folks on opposing sides of the army who, or military who put their weapons down and came to the same jazz club to listen to Benny Carter. Folks who were trying to kill each other during the middle of the day, at night, came to the same jazz club to listen to Benny Carter. you talking about power within the music. We can talk about the Underground Railroad and slavery and the secret meanings and the double entendre within songs. You are familiar with that. But there's another thing here. This music is born out of oppression. That is what makes it so powerful. Because you can go all around the world, people who don't even live in capitalistic countries, people who don't have this racial tension that we have here, but are utilizing this music. And I'm talking about spirituals, blues, gospel, and jazz right now. I haven't got to hip hop. You can't even hear spiritual in the black church now. Well, actually, you can, but only during February. You go to a blues festival now, see ne'er black person there. I would argue the same for jazz. There's a reason, though. The music is practical. It's functional. The music speaks for that period of time. And then, like something that is used, we toss it over our shoulder. The spirituals got us out of slavery. Once we're free, we don't need that stuff anymore. Matter of fact, by the time we migrate, we don't even want to hear it anymore because it reminds us of that past situation of pain. The blues gets us to migration, the notion of urbanization. We out of the rural area and into the big city. Some of us came right into Boston. Some of us didn't have that rural situation. But the blues speak about that. And once we get to the 1950s, we don't need it anymore. Then we get to R&B and soul. And, of course, gospel music. Which gives us another situation of who we are, self-reflective in many ways. Our pain, our fury, and also the challenge that many of my colleagues have been talking about. Aretha Franklin, Riri. That's Reverend C.L. Franklin's daughter. But she turned the tide a little bit. Brother Sam Cooke sang Jesus Be a Fence before Fred Hammond. Turned the tide a little bit. Marvin Gaye turned the tide a little bit. This notion of secular versus sacred, in many ways it deals with the humanity. Tupac. Can I be a religious or spiritual person and deal with my own human faulties, my human frailties? Or can I only be religious when I'm living the religious lifestyle, whatever that is? Can I be human? Can I deal with all the stuff that I'm dealing with, or do I need to leave it in my closet? See, hip-hop deals with that. Gangster rap deals with that. My opening statement, if the black church, or the church in general, was vigilant about its mission, widows, the poor, probably wouldn't even have hip-hop culture, wouldn't need it. My closing analogy is this. A baby. A baby can't speak the same language we speak. But that baby needs to communicate with us. So they cry. And when they cry, we have a tendency to go through the litany of things that we do. Is the baby wet? Is the baby hungry? Does the baby need to burp? So we try that. It doesn't work. Now the baby doesn't cry the same way that it cried before. It cries louder, rawer, grittier. So now we put down the phone. We close the laptop. And then we put all our focus on that baby, trying to understand and figure out what is the message that's being transmitted. Can I receive it? Can I analyze it? Can I reform it and respond to it in the appropriate manner so the baby will stop crying? Fast forward 14 years. The baby doesn't cry anymore. The baby cusses. I don't want to respond to that. The baby doesn't cry anymore. The baby acts up in school, gets thrown out. I don't want to respond to that anymore. The baby does everything that you tell him not to do at 14. Misogyny, violence. See, I would argue that if we get back to dealing, and whatever religious belief system you have or hold, there's a notion of love that's universal. And we got to get back to the core notion of what love is.
the least of these? Will we deal with that? I would argue that's where we need to put some attention at. Can we really love? Not, you get out of here, you don't look right, you don't fit the profile, you can't come into this church, you don't have the right clothes. Can we love? Can we love? I don't have any time to yield, but I'm going to yield whatever seconds I have to the panel.
Before we begin the discussion, can we just give a round of applause to the entire panel for a fabulous presentation? Absolutely fantastic. And I just want to say something for a couple of minutes about why I decided to do the introductions. We have, as I said in the beginning, this amazing panel who work and have done work on hip-hop and who are teachers at every level, have degrees, work in organizations, doing this, doing that. And it's really important for us to hear each other and know what everybody's doing, but also for everyone to know that we are all involved in hip-hop at some level and can do many things, and that we're a variety of people working in hip-hop, especially in academic environment. And as Dead Press says, it is bigger than hip-hop. We're going to take questions and comments. If you have questions, one question, and comments, we want to leave them to 1 minute. First question to the panel. If you want to direct it to someone in particular, could you do that? We have mics back here.
We got travel time.
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I have a question. You talked about the sacred and secular divide. I'm wondering how we close this. I think even in the black church, issues of sexuality, we seem to, make this secular and sacred divide. And I want to know if how it's hindering progress in the black community, and also how it may be enhancing this generational divide that we have.
I'll take a stab at that. I think one thing is we have to realize that nobody's perfect and nobody's whole. And there, 3/5 is 3/5. 3/5 as adultery versus 3/5 as this, 3/5 is this. Sin is sin. And we all have it. And I think that recognition allows us to see our brothers and sisters who come into the fold in a variety of different ways and situations as being equal to us and needing the same thing that we need. Even as caretakers, even as care providers, even as spiritual leaders, we're broken. And we have a tendency not to acknowledge that and not want to deal with that. And so we kind of suppress that, and then we put that out on other folks. And the reality is that we all need a fixing, as the old songwriters used to say. And so the reality is, in our communities, there has to be this acknowledgement that nobody's better than anybody else, nobody's more important than anybody else, and that we are all equal in terms of human beings, and that we are actually more similar than we are different. And that those of us can't, be condescending and look down upon folks who come from different places and different states. Because again, our mission, our goal has to be to deal with the least of these if we're going to make this, experiment called democracy work.
I appreciate you leading with the question on sexuality. Given the contradictions that are happening, that we see some major splits inside. All of the 7 historic denominations have issued statements against same-sex marriage. My own beloved denomination, the Church of God in Christ, of which I am 3rd generation, both my grandfather and my great-grandfather were elders in this tradition, a tradition I love that saved my life. We issued a statement against gay marriage. Yet our 3rd sentence in our Constitution is a conscientious objector sentence. It says explicitly that we will not participate in war. C.H. Mason, our founder, was arrested for objecting to World War I and World War II. but we've never issued a public statement against anything in the history of our denomination. But for some reason, somehow, we decided to issue a statement against gay marriage. Part of what is happening is that there's a significant organizing force inside our churches. There's a book called Steeplejacking that one of my colleagues, John Dorhire, has written about the way in which the Institute for Religion and Democracy has been organizing inside mainline denominations in order to swing those denominations to the right. In 1992, the Christian Coalition had a meeting and said that we're going to go organize around homophobia inside black communities because of their particular conservatism around homophobia, and use homophobia as a wedge issue to shift those institutions to the right. And so as a result of that, what we have to understand that there's a concerted effort inside our institutions to shift them to the right, because the African American church is perceived as a left of center discourse because it begins with the humanity of black people, which is a left of center of inquiry and assumption inside the American empire that's predicated on us not being human. Right. And so there's this idea that our churches historically, now let's be clear that it's not always been like, there's a mythology also in black communities and in the world about black churches that all of them were progressive. And that we celebrate that mythology, and it particularly gets set up against young people. Where all of our churches were marching, everybody over 40 marched with King, which is just not the case. Martin Luther King got put out of the National Baptist Convention. Gardner C. Taylor has an eloquent phrase where he says he was forced out of the house of his fathers. Had to leave with 2,000 other black preachers out of the National Baptist Convention to found the Progressive Baptist Convention because of the stronghold that John H. Jackson has over the National Baptist Convention, and they don't want them doing that civil rights mess inside their churches. And so we want to claim, I want to essentially make an essentialist claim about that mythology, say that the black church is a left of center project, and say that the least of these are gay brothers and sisters, make that claim and demand out of our tradition that we support gay brothers and sisters. I'm leaving the Church of God in Christ. I am turning my credentials in, joining the United Church of Christ, because gay folks are catching hell, and I am obligated by the biblical mandate to stand in solidarity with the least of these. And so what I'm saying is that part of this, so the sexuality question, I think, is an essential question about where the direction are going, and lastly, for us to be able to tell the truth. Right. Just look at our organs. Who's playing our organs? In the black church, another mythology that is normalized is that the choir director is gay. That is a normative stereotype inside of our churches, and one can argue that black choir directing is a queer aesthetic. That the snapping of the fingers, the clapping of the hands, the rolling of the neck, the drag that is associated with the wearing of the robe that the choir director wears, even if the choir is not in a robe, right, has to do with that these elements are present inside of our churches. We have to be willing to embrace them and understand that homophobia is about organizing a political agenda that is ultimately not in our interest.
Good evening. Wow, that was a lot. My question is geared towards DJ Lady Grace. Like Mariana White-Hammond, myself, I'm also a minister, but at the same time, I do have this love and affinity for hip-hop. So I'm constantly looking at how the overlaps happen in terms of yourself, Corey Red, so forth and so forth. But then I come to Pastor Mace, and I look at his conversion, and how he supposedly went to school and got his doctorate and so forth, and then a couple years later,
that TDJ said, does he have the same?
He has an honorary doctorate from a Bible college that doesn't award.
That's what I thought. I was looking into that as well. I couldn't find nothing on it. But then I turn around and he comes out with this mixtape with G-Unit, the DJ Woo Kid mixtape, in which he makes horrible references to the church in terms of, and I quote, "I got hoes in the back of the church," end quote. So my question comes down to, you said that it is an issue in terms of how the churches didn't necessarily prepare the artists when they were in their house. But us as a community, what can we do to help our artists? Because in the end, Pastor Mace does have an influence. He does have a crowd. His show does come on TV. His Mace and Bethel Ministries does have an audience of people who are looking to get into the faith, but at the same time, they see the contradiction. So what can we do as a community to help this or rectify the situation?
Mm-hmm. I first want to start answering your question with scripture, so I'm not sharing just my sole opinion with you. And it comes from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. And it's talking about overseers and deacons. It says, he must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. The problem that happened to Mace is the same problem that happens to a lot of celebrities who have a desire to have a relationship with God, go to a church, and they push him to the forefront too quickly. The problem with Mace is that he never really learned. You know, you could read the Bible in a full year and still not know God. There's a lot of things you got to experience about God by walking with them, by talking with them, by sitting under people and learning. How in the world do you become a pastor in 3 years? You know, you've been saved for 3 years and become a pastor. It doesn't make sense. People had their own personal agendas that they were pushing, for pushing Mace. And now, you know, even now, people are suffering for it. I mean, there's a lot of things that Mace still doesn't know, and the people that he's shepherding are people who don't know the word, who really don't, you know, we could argue all day. So the solution to the problem is, you know, when you have a young person who wants to be a Christian rap artist, begin teaching the word. They need to be studying the Bible more than they need to be writing songs. You know, take the time and show them scripts. You know, show them the scriptures. You know, find out what questions they have. My most memorable experience as a DJ is I was DJing at this youth event. 800 kids, all from different churches all over the county, and I wanted to give away a CD. And the question I asked is, the first person who can run up here and tell me what the greatest commandment is, I'll give you this free CD. Not one out of 800 could tell me what the greatest commandment was. Just to show you how bad of a problem it is, you know. So the solution is teach them the word. You know.
I want to respond to the second half of your question. The whole thing, I learned a while ago that regardless of what credentials Mace has or whether we agree with him or not, God can use anybody to do his work. So yeah. I don't think that, rather than focus on Mace and that, the providence of God is so huge that, he's used clouds and burning bushes and mules and mumbling fools and all kind of stuff in the Bible. So, you know, the issue to me is this. When you look at a generation, and really when we talk about the generational divide, we're talking about two almost interesting dynamics, the civil rights generation and the hip-hop generation, so-called. And the best analogy I have for this is this. When the civil rights generation, and thank God for them for all the things that they did, continue to do. Praise God for their sacrifice. But when they came home, they never debriefed their kids. You know, and so when we grew up, you know, our notion of civil rights was wearing an African medallion on our chest and wearing a kufi with an African sign on it or wearing a shirt with Malcolm X on it and, you know, iconizing Dr. King. And then we got beat over the head for that. And see, there's this internal thing that's going on here. There's no corrective measures or no sharing. You know, I remember, growing up in my household, my parents argued. They always argued somewhere else. And God bless them. I didn't want to see them argue. But when I got married, it was like, okay, how am I supposed to deal with this? I never saw that part of the situation. And so there's this disconnect here. And it's nobody's fault. But the issue is we can't start bad-mouthing each other. The notion is, how can we come to the table and everybody pull up a chair to the table and let's put it on the table, right? It's not about you did this wrong or I did this wrong or I'm not responsible or you were more responsible or you had to walk 5 miles to go to school and I got a bus. Or it's not about that. It's about here was the strategy. I forgot to show it to you. Here was the mission. I forgot to show it to you. Here's the purpose. I forgot to show it to you. Here are the tenets. I forgot to show it to you. Now you need to learn this. And then let's talk.
I just want to respond to what you said just real quickly. While I agree that we should come to the table to discuss these things, the problem you're going to find is that nobody wants to be held accountable or have any kind of discussion because you can't judge them. It's like this whole big thing of Christians now where you can't judge them. And that's not even what the Bible teaches. it kills me when I go on the message board and saying, well, as Christians you can't judge. I'm like, matter of fact, the Bible teaches you how to judge and tells you what to, to do. So I think that's the problem you're actually going to find.
And we have a question here, and then this will be our last question over there.
Well, just to build, can we get two in a row? Instead of us answering back, can we get like 3 questions in a row?
Sure.
And then maybe we can answer them in closing.
Let me see on the other hand. I saw there other hands as well. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Get my man right here.
So why don't we get them and the panelists will respond.
Okay.
Thank you to all the panelists, and so this is one of many questions in your comments, and thank you all for sharing from your perspective and your knowledge about it. I'm intrigued by a couple of the strands, and just building on that question in terms of the generational divide. So forward-looking, and for those of us who are squarely and proudly situated in Black religious institutions, I would just love for the panel to push forward to either dream or report out on spaces and ways that the reconciliation happens, or formats in which these conversations across generation happen for hip-hop generation. And for me, I'm always looking at the fact that in terms of meaning making as an enterprise, has always been where the music's been housed. Out of the community comes music, comes art, and it has meaning in the context of community. Mm-hmm. Now we don't have those communities as such, and the music becomes a drawing part for community, but it's generationally divided. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that we can leave the critique aside, but informed by the critique, what is the future? What should it look like? Or what would it look like if you were in charge in terms of our community and saving our souls?
Hi, I'll try to keep this really brief. Let me just preface this by saying that I am a child of a preacher, and I'm also a lover of music. But I have a really big problem with this idea of outsourcing responsibility. A lot of you have mentioned you work with the youth. You've mentioned the notion of frustration in the youth and confusion, yet we're focusing on institutions to give meaning, such as the institution of hip-hop, which I consider an institution, or the institution of religion. And I would be much prouder of a 6th to 8th grader if they, 1, had a concept of who God is, 2, had some sense of how to form a personal relationship with God, and 3, knew what a thesis statement is and could write an essay and is thinking about college versus quoting Tupac verses. And I mean, and I like Tupac. I don't have any bones to pick with him, but I'm just wondering about where we're placing our focus and why there's not more personal agency, and we're not talking about parental responsibility and developing these children to have an idea of who they are as a person.
I'll try to keep it brief too, hitting on or building off of what Dr. Price has talked about, and the discontinuity of black music over time, over generations with jazz and blues. Do we need to do more, and particularly the hip-hop generation, who we're all kind of grown now, do we need to do more to safeguard?
Kind of grown.
We're working on it. We're working on it. Do we need to do more to safeguard our cultural forms as a people going forward, and to protect against cultural appropriation and commercialism? Is that an area where we just haven't done enough as a people?
Well, we got one more right over here.
One more.
My question is directed first at Reverend Sekou, and then a second one at Mr. Price. When you say that Christianity left down its guard and left spaces for Islam to pick up the pieces, I think that that's not empirically accurate. In part, if you look, and I'm speaking now as a minister and mathematician who used to be at Mosque Number 1 in Chicago, and most of the Muslims there asked me to go into the prisons and teach, counsel, deal with preparation for release, provide real services so that families could be reunited and reconciliation between members who are alienated could take place. Nobody else was doing that work. And therefore there is a material basis for the rise of Islam in real service truly to the least among these. Okay?
No argument.
So, in a way, I think it's a kind of cheap shot at Islam to actually say that it's picking up where Christianity left off or lost, as opposed to Christianity in its own merits failed to make the case for itself. Secondly, I'd like to deal with your issue of so-called secular and sacred in Dorsey, or even in the second exemplar that you gave, okay? If you were to be in a place like Chicago, you would come across little small churches of Mississippi. Now, I'm speaking about the 60s now, 70s, 80s. You would come across these little churches from Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, all right, where people literally brought in a clear sense that this is a music of service, for liturgy, for worship, okay? And even though the chord structure and other words may be changed when it becomes Sam Cooke, we clearly knew the difference between when it is a music in the service of either divinity or eschatology or the searching for the basic underlying meaning of life, as opposed to when it's about, getting down, making love, and feeling good. And in that sense, to me, there's always been a clear, absolute, big, bright line between the sacred and the secular. Your version of Dorsey and even James Cleveland, whom I heard a lot then in Chicago, and to catch him live, not on the records. It was clear when James and Billy Presty was playing with him. It was clear when these brothers understood that they were dealing with the sacred in an absolute sense, as opposed to the secular in the jive time, good time, places. And in that sense, I think you're fundamentally wrong when you don't see that bright line that at least the musicians make when they're in the sacred and when they're in the secular.
I just want to say one more.
Okay, but let me just say, everybody. I mean, I'm glad that people are like really sparky now. But y'all woke up at the, you're waking up at the end. You know what I mean? It's just like, I think you can appreciate that I actually have a really hard job up here. And all right.
Well,
so
can we do
have
this?
Four. So let's do two more, and that's it. Okay.
Two more,
Just
and then
two.
they'll corner us, and they
Fabulous. Okay.
Yeah, but I got bodyguards, so
all
don't.
right. Okay. So we have two. These two, and that's. Oh, you want
those two, and then we. Okay.
Okay.
I got the mic. So, the first thing I want to say is that theologically, the difference between Islam and Christianity is non-existent. As a matter of fact, most of the early Muslims were Christian, and the early protectors of Muslims were Christians. Secondly, African American faith tradition is based on reconfigured Exodus tradition, which deals with the whole idea of chosen people, 400 years and strangers in a strange land, who were required a song and mirth and things of that nature, and that after the 400 years they were supposed to come out with some good things, both materially and spiritually. So, which speaks to the whole question of exceptionalism. And I think that when we talk about religion and what we're supposed to be about, is we're talking about excellence. We're talking about making it, as it says in the Quran, let there be a community of you who enjoin good and forbid evil. That's it.
I wasn't going to say anything. I'm the father of DJ Gray, or Lady Grace. And I'm as traditional can be. I'm from Alabama. I remember when James Cleveland came on the scene. Shirley Caesar, all of them, okay? In the gospel church at that time, they was talking about James Cleveland like you're talking about hip-hop. Exactly. Okay? When rhythm first came in the church, you had a problem. That's right. So I look at hip-hop as just another phase. This, too, will pass. In fact, even it's nothing new under the sun.
Okay.
Okay? But that's what I was just sitting here listening to the panel going on and coming on. It's going to pass. Okay. These young people today don't know nothing about the civil rights movement. They have no knowledge of it. I paid for my daughter's education. What she know about a struggle?
A track scholarship didn't help at Northeastern University.
Okay. All right. Let's have the panelists respond to a number of the questions that came out.
Can I go first, and then I'm gonna be quick. One, I was taking a cheap shot at the church, not at Islam. I have an enormous amount of respect of Islam. I practice Orthodox for a year and a half. I have 2/3 of the Quran memorized. Islam played a very definitive role in my life. Farrakhan sent me back to the church because of his political discourses around his critique of the Old Testament and New Testament and the way in which they employed it as a kind of theological weapon to kind of wake up black people, so to speak. So it was my entree into where I am now studying with James Cone. So I have an enormous amount of respect. My critique is that because black churches were not doing, I agree with you, right? So I'm going to make I'm publicly shifting, that perhaps my critique should be that when I say the churches weren't there, meaning that they were not engaged in space and working with the most disenfranchised elements inside of our communities as constructed by certain experiences, particularly that of black men and the rise of the prison industrial complex. We completely missed that shift. So I agree with you fully. And when I'm in prisons and spend time there are always more Muslims there than churches. I agree with you fully. I think you're very right. I was taking a cheap shot at the church. I'll revise that one-liner. Secondly, I think on this question of the Exodus narrative in terms of black life, I really think that particularly, and Joseph could say something about this, about the last 200 years of printed literature around African American religions and the field of African American, the study of African American religions has primarily been hanging on the Exodus narrative. I think it has to shift now to an exilic narrative. Martin Luther King 1963 speech, the famous I Have a Dream speech, people say that about the third paragraph, he says, the Negro is like an exile in his own homeland, right? So it's this understanding that black people are here in the midst of all this prosperity, but have no real access to it. And then Cornel West's critique of post-Katrina about Katrina folks being exiles in the promised land. So I think the exilic narrative may be a better understanding for us in the study of African American religion, and also as it plays itself out liturgically and in a homiletic structure in the way in which we preach about black experiences inside America, because ain't no promised land. Right. The young people are going to come, these brothers and sisters coming in and out of prisons are going to come back to fragmented communities. They're going to come back to churches ill-prepared for them. And let's not even begin to talk about the 160,000 soldiers who returned to this city, this country, having experienced all kinds of war, all kinds of violence, and we have nothing for them. We are not prepared for this. And so I think that part of the exilic narrative may be a way for us to construct intellectually, theologically, liturgically, and homiletically a way to talk about the black experience as we move forward in the 21st century.
I just want to interject. But one way we may handle this and close out, because there's a reception and concern about that, is if every panelist could comment on whichever question they'd like to comment on, and try to hold your comments to about 2 minutes, and whatever it is that you want to respond to in particular, the panelists who haven't responded to any of the questions themselves, if you could do that before we leave, I think that would be great.
You want us to go ahead?
Yeah, why don't we just go, why don't we start with you, Joseph, and then we'll go down. We've heard from Reverend Sekou.
Two things real quick. First thing I would say is that this has become a very church conversation, perhaps reflecting, who's here today. But while I agree with Reverend Sekou's move to the exilic narrative, we might also ask in what ways does the biblical narrative constrain the possibilities and opportunities for figuring out these hosts of problems, right? The black church is never comprised, I think studies show, more than 50% of black communities, right? So what about Islam? What about these other possibilities that we've been talking about and show up throughout hip-hop music? Second piece is to go to the question of sacred and secular, is to say that, right, in pointing to Dorsey, that this question is always up for grabs. What is sacred? What is religion? Right? What defines us in that regard? Right? Rosetta Tharpe had a different example of sacred and secular. In some ways, it compromised her relationship with the black church as she tried to cross over. So what we define as sacred is up for grabs in every historical moment in different ways by different individuals who participate in the conversation. Second piece, and third piece, while I know we're talking about hip-hop, I want to also say that we ought to resist the fetishization of hip-hop as something pure in the same way that we speak of the church as something, as a pure entity in that itself. So like hip-hop is part of a broader repertoire of black youth cultural practices, right? Black youth also listen to Korn. They listen to a host of other things that figures into the way they make sense of their experience. So, and the same move to not fetishize hip-hop, that we don't also place all the onus on it as being either the problem or the possibility for the solution, right? Black churches just there's shared resonance in American culture on these issues of homosexuality, homophobia, what have you. We're all struggling with these same questions, and we do it in many different ways. And then the final piece in terms of answers is to look at the work that folks are doing on the grassroots in terms of creating critical spaces. I'm not so sure that in recent years churches, mosques, what have you, while affirming beliefs and spiritual practices, have provided necessarily the critical spaces. But I think that the work that gets done with young people addressing how hip-hop figures positively or negatively into their lives, questions about sexuality. I think, the work that Professor Marla Frederick does and how black women sort through all these different experiences between Sunday, right, in the various aspects of their lives, points to opportunities for thinking about cultivating critical spaces for young people, for generations, across generations, what have you, to deal with any number of questions in a way that allows for an open dialogue and creating the possibility of even some shared space that may be difficult to even come to.
Okay, thank you. Mariama?
I want to address mostly the question about the idea of outsourcing responsibility and why don't we want them to write a thesis. I think we want all of that. I mean, I think that if you were able to look at our curriculum, you would have a better sense of what we actually do, because we ask young people to use debate forms. We have, for instance, is graffiti an art or a crime, and we make them take an affirmative or a negative response and create their own set of thesis as part of that and debate back with each other in a traditional debate format. But we also encourage them to do research and not just print your first Google page, right? But how do you find who the owner of a company is and what they look like, and teach them how to do that, because it's not always as easy as they think. Who actually made the final decision on the piece of music that you're listening to? And when they do that and find out that the same person controls, and the same three companies, essentially, three media companies control something like 80% of the hip-hop industry. A lot of our young people are surprised that they also control Nickelodeon and VH1 and all of these other things. So for us, the emphasis is around critical thinking. And also, I think we try to find a space between the left brain and right brain development of young people. I think it's also particularly important, as they talk about in the 21st century, the importance of right brain thinking as we develop into a society that looks a lot more at design and meaning making. We would like our young people to be at the forefront of that. And so we think that there's an importance of art in helping them to develop that in context of also doing critical thinking. But we also have to reflect the reality that I get young people coming to my office who cannot tell time off a clock if it's not digital, and they are in the 11th grade. So there's also the reality of us having to deal with what the schools are or are not doing for those young people. And I think that's important and really to think about. And I think the other really important thing in terms of the way we look at hip-hop is young people don't make an investment in their life if they don't think that they have a future. And if you don't have a hope and a vision for your life, the rest of it is a waste of time. And so the most important thing for me is a young person leaves our organization with a sense of hope and vision for themselves. I may not always love what their vision is. I hope it evolves over time. But when young people come in, and I know this is another organization we have partnered with, they ask teens on their application, where do you see yourself? Out of 100 young people that they asked that to 6 of them wrote dead. And when young people are willing to write that on a piece of paper, nothing else is going to work until you get that concept out of their head. And so that is, I think, the most important. And that's why I would love to see the church and all sorts of spiritual institutions get more involved. Because if they do not have hope and a vision, everything else is a moot point.
Thank you. Miriam.
I'm just going to respond to some questions that were posed earlier. Can hip-hop serve as a change agent, and can it serve as a relevant spiritual and theological device in the cultural context? And I just want to respond with the Warbucks record, a paragraph that they've put out for the reason why they've started their record label, hip-hop label. Because I do not see the future as bleak when it comes to hip hop and Islam. The goal of the Five Elements Project is to demystify the negative perceptions of Muslims, to destroy the us against them mentality. We as a people, domestically and globally, cannot advance our ideologies and initiatives until we form an amalgamated and comprehensive front. We are committed to creating a solid infrastructure and vibrant global community by acknowledging our differences and building on our similarities. We see hip hop as a means to an end, as opposed to an end to a means. Hip hop is a dynamic medium that provides the means to an egalitarian society.
Thank you, Lady Grace.
And I just want to respond to the question of how do we bridge this gap. The first thing I want to say is the church, first of all, needs to remember that the power is in the gospel alone. It has nothing to do with with the person delivering the message. That power is not any stronger when a person is in a suit versus someone wearing jeans and Timbs. The gospel is the gospel. The second thing the church needs to recognize that will help bridge this gap is when they move themselves out the way and allow the Holy Spirit to do the job of convicting that person of the things that they need to change. A friend of mine called me in Florida. He has a hip-hop church down there, and he was excited because there was an individual who gave his life to Christ who was one of the biggest underground freestylists in Tampa. And he had some things going on in his life at his time of conversion that he knew had to be eradicated. But all they did was teach him the word. And as they taught him the word, the Holy Spirit started convicting him about his lifestyle, and he started to change. They never said one word, just the gospel alone. The third thing that I wanted to say was the gap in the church is bigger here in this region versus other regions. And that's primarily because we live in a region of intellectualism, you know. They want to stay almost like modern day Pharisees. They got to see it first to believe it. Right now, there's a Christian car club, called the Holy Rollers, that goes to. They're pretty big now, pretty big. They go to these secular car shows. They pass out Bibles. They pray with people, and they were actually featured on the first documentary that was ever made about urban car racing. And they're not at the end. They're in the middle. And they show them praying. They show them all these things. The things that God called us to do. Go out and make disciples. Go out and reach people. I'm planning by the way, this is a plug-in too. I'm starting a chapter up in this region. But, again, it's just taking the time to understand that you can use whatever your gifts and interests are for the glory of God.
Thank you. And Amy Price.
The reconciliation piece has to come through conversation, and it has to come through conversation with however many sides there are. It's not a polar. Just what this gentleman said about his daughter is the beginning of the conversation. So we can't hold people accountable for what they don't know. And so the notion of responsibility, you have to deal with the notion of expectations. And so until the generation who seem like they're not being responsible because they have no idea about struggle, until they learn about struggle, there's really no conversation. And so we have to figure out how can we bridge these notions that divide us, even internally, in many ways. I respect your question, and I thank you for the passion of it. What's interesting about your question is that although you can hear the sacredness in the singing of Dorsey and Cleveland and whoever else we want to mention in that, right? And you're absolutely correct. Even the church couldn't hear it. And that's why Dorsey was getting thrown out of churches when he first started writing that music. And the notion is my musical analysis, and you're right, that's aesthetic, and it's clearly not theological. And so the notion is that the music is sacred music, clearly. I would never argue that. But to many people, so is Marvin Gaye. To many people, so is Tupac. And so we have this distinction in terms of how we go back and use terminology in terms of what is sacred and secular, and how do we distinguish those two. And my thing is, there is a distinction, but it's not the distinction that we prominently use in colloquial English. I think the distinction is a little bit different in terms of the notion of spirituality and what is the intent of the music. And I think you can have intent on both sides. So perhaps I should have cleared that up. But I respect what you're saying. I think you're absolutely right. But there is this notion in terms of, again, this divide generationally. Folks are, if you see a young person who has watched their grandparent work for 50 years and get ready to retire, and the retirement is taken up from under them, and mom and daddy have worked all these years and their house is taken up from under them in foreclosure, and they see the church not do anything, then their hesitancy to deal with the church is like this. And so somehow they have to receive the hope and survival and the expression, and many people do it through quote-unquote secular music, which I would argue is not all that secular, because of the notion of what the musician who created and breathes their own life into the music, it may be secular in shape, but it's sacred in the notion of where it's coming from. But I'd love to talk with you more when we leave here.
Hopefully we can continue this conversation during the reception. Let's thank the panel and thank all of you, and Harambe and Chandra.